Well, good afternoon. I have the pleasure to do a little fireside chat here with Archana Vermeule-Polly, if I got that right.
Close enough.
Who's the head of strategy and product for AI ML at Amazon Web Services, which, as all of you know, is the largest cloud platform, I think, in the world. But instead of introducing her, I thought I would have a little fun here and have Anthropic introduce her. Anthropic is an engine similar to OpenAI that Amazon invested up to $4 billion in. So Microsoft invested in OpenAI and Amazon's invested into Anthropic. So I asked Anthropic what it knows about her. And this may turn out a little bit like my Mid-Journey picture, which is a stylized version that bears little resemblance to reality, but let's see how well it did.
That was mine too. But
Okay, so she's a distinguished engineer and VP at AWS, formerly in charge of databases and analytics and machine learning.
go on.
Okay. She's been working at Amazon since 2006, so she's one of the longest standing executives in the company.
Keep going. This is a really good story, so I'm listening to this one too.
She is considered a pioneer in cloud databases, having led the deployment of Amazon Aurora, which is a MySQL and Postgres compatible database.
I'll be taking my colleagues' credit, but we'll keep going again.
Okay. You hold 20 patents and 15 technical papers in the area.
That was a wonderful story, none of which was true.
She serves as a board of trustees of the Anita Borg Institute for Women in Technology.
Not true.
She's a PhD in computer science from the University of Wisconsin-Madison.
My dad would have liked it,
Okay.
but again, no.
She helped establish the Amazon office in Bangalore, India. That's now one of their largest offices.
Not every Indian establishes the offices in India.
And finally, Forbes ranked her as one of the top 50 people in tech.
This was new news to me too.
Okay, so we have a lot to discuss in terms of models and accuracy and everything else. But our goal here is to really spend the next 40 minutes or so and really talk through a variety of the areas and issues related to AI. Certainly given the Amazon experience, I'm sure you've seen a lot talking to a variety of different enterprise customers. But let me start with the simple question, and that is, without dating myself, 33 years ago, my first job out of college was at Ford Motor Company, and I was in the AI group. This was 33 years ago. We've been talking about AI for a very long time. So what's changed? Why do we feel now is different?
I think the biggest thing is it's now in the front. I mean, it was always in the background. I mean, all of us who've been in technology or building products have been using AI and ML in some way, shape, or form across the problems we've been trying to solve. And sometimes these have been tricky problems that you're trying to solve. And there is a maturity curve with what we've been doing in this space, and we've all been actively engaged. I think the biggest shift that happened last year was really when you look at what ChatGPT did, it sort of gave people the idea of getting access to information in a meaningful way, and you could question sometimes in a very creative, maybe extensive way, that they had not seen before. And that's what brought it to the forefront and got it the kind of attention it did. And it's the idea of not that you don't have access to data. We all had access to data. We still have access to a ton of data. I think I heard the previous speakers also mention this. It's the idea that you get some level of instant insight or a level of summarization or a perspective of what that information is very quickly that's very powerful and very enabling. And I think that's what really caught the consumer interest. But equally, I think there is a duality in a consumer's behavior. I, as a consumer, am extremely amused when I get lofty descriptions of what I could be. Or, if I'm planning a vacation and it gives me this amazing trip that doesn't exist, but I can get amused and go verify it again, and I'm okay with that. I'm okay with getting some information that's probably a bit theatrical or made up, but it's how I experiment. But the same thing, I, as the consumer, when I'm trusting you, the corporation, with my data, have a very different standard. I expect you to protect me. I expect you to safeguard my interests. I expect you to make sure that the trust I put in your brand and your organization is extended. And that's where the enterprise adoption and the enterprise implementation of how this gets meaningfully absorbed, you'll see a different trajectory and curve. And some of these discussions, it's been amazing discussions here today, right? These are all super valid, super meaningful, super relevant discussions that we should all be having. Because that's where the enterprises have a responsibility, and honestly, are expected to look and operate and consume and deliver this technology in a very different way than a consumer would use it.
So is there a scenario where this is just part of the hype curve that we've seen with so many other technologies? We saw it with wearable computing, we've seen it with autonomous vehicles, where there's an enormous amount of investment into a segment being chased by PE and VC folks, but then there's disappointment that it doesn't live up to the hype.
I don't think there's a hype curve. I think there's a lot of interest. There is absolutely a lot of interest, and because of the interest and the conversations, there's a lot of people trying to figure out and understand what this is, and very quickly get a lens of what this could do for us. But I think there is a very real fact that this is fairly transformational for organizations. The reason you have these discussions about hype and other sort of themes is because we as human beings sometimes, even though history proves that technology and transformation and revolutions happen and the way we know and the way we consume things change, still hesitate to accept and embrace that change and take that change in a meaningful way that we take forward. This is at least my worldview. So I do think this is going to be very, very impactful. I think the interest you're seeing is going to be tremendous. There's always, anytime there's interest in that level of transformation, you have a healthy dose of noise that you have to accept. But equally, you have to start to think about, how do you meaningfully make this a part of your business? How do you meaningfully make this something that helps society in the right way? And how do you take the knowledge and the learnings, to your point, you've been in AI for 30 plus years now, right? Or at least in some way, shape, or form, or the experience that was just shared in this room, there's a lot of really good experience on how we can use this for good in a phenomenal way. And our ability to transform the world into a better world with this, I believe, is actually much higher if we are all intentional about it.
Okay, so you've obviously seen a variety of different companies doing a variety of different things. So what are some of the most powerful use cases you've seen to make the world a better place, as you say?
It varies by, the commonality cross-industry I've seen is, I have not gone into any meeting or any customer conversation where they are saying, I don't know about this. They're almost saying, I've heard about it, I'm curious about it, I want to know how I can materially go drive better outcomes. If you talk to a CEO or a board or a key leader within an organization, it is always comes down to, how do I make sure that I grow my business? How do I make sure that I drive better value? How do I make sure that all of the good work I've done to build my brand is enhanced by any investments I make in this space? And that's a consistent theme cross-industry. What's super interesting is how people are approaching it, and I think that's where I'm seeing a variation of it. There's a theme where customers were saying, hey, we're going to give all of our employees access to this, and we want to see what people do with it. We want to see how they're creative about solving new problems. I want to see new things that they want to go after, maybe a faster way to do what we did before. And so they're using the idea of experimentation in a way to sort of scale and look at ways in which they solve for it. And then I'm seeing themes where customers are saying, I actually want to be very targeted about this. I actually have a growth requirement where I'm trying to build a new product, but it's taking me 8 months, and I want to be intentional about building that same product in half the time, and can I actually do it, and how will I use this in a way that's meaningful? I am looking for a new market growth area that I have wanted to get into, but previously I ran into these 4 issues, and now can I solve this with a combination of my investments in ML and with generative AI in a meaningful way? And so I think there's a targeted focus as well as sort of a scale focus, and they're both working. But what I'll tell you I've seen, candidly, is those are highly dependent on the organizational culture you build. Organizations that are built with a innovative and a disruptive and a learning culture embrace this and are willing to take some risks and are willing to take some of those bets, and they're willing to learn along the way. Organizations that, for good reason, sometimes are more conservative about how they tread and where they enter, are looking at it more carefully about what are the safer use cases to go after, where they can go experiment, learn, look at insights before they start to scale. So you're seeing all of it. But the super interesting part is it's almost everyone. I mean, I have not yet met a single person who said, we're not interested.
Right. So let's talk about data privacy. I run a company that has somewhere around 50 petabytes of data sitting in your cloud.
Thank you.
The last thing I want is my data making its way into a trained model that other people benefit from unless I'm able to sort of monetize it. I also know, for instance, at Microsoft, some of the development teams are not allowed to use Microsoft's own code generation tools, Visual Studio Copilot, because they're afraid that that code's going to get into a model that then makes its way out into the world. So how do you protect data privacy in a world where these models are trained on tons and tons and tons of data?
I mean, data privacy has always been a key and core tenet for most organizations. And this fundamentally comes down to you as an organization protecting your IP and your differentiation and leveraging a technology in a meaningful way so that you don't necessarily lose your advantage, but you sort of leverage the technology to enhance your advantage. That's basically what you're getting at with the 50 petabytes. Thank you again for that. But the core essence here again is what are your guardrails in your model selection? Do you actually want to go build a model? Do you want to consume a model? You now have the ability, we have the ability to take a model, make a copy of it, and run it in your own environment so you can get the outcomes you want without some of those leakages happening. So there's a lot of work underway. We're doing it. There's folks across that have been engaging in it. But keeping your IP protected, keeping your IP differentiated to the outcomes that you want are going to be super important. I have this conversation with customers all the time, right? They always say, well, what do you think we should do? And I said, this is your brand. What you've built your business, however big it is and however vast it is your brand. And your brand stands for something. It stands for something to the people that consume it. We're giving you access, and when we're all investing, there are a number of us, both us and others in the space, are investing actively because we see the promise of how this could be transformational. But we're doing this with the intention that we want to partner with these brands to help them and solve for them in a meaningful way so they're growing and successful. But at the end of the day, you own that brand. It's your decision.
So, follow-up question. So folks like George Gilder has written, 20, 30 books. Bill Dembski, we have a lot of authors in here. Those books are available, and they're obviously put into the Amazon store and things like that. How do authors or generators of content, whether it's pictures, whether it's books, whether it's videos, keep from their material being, basically part and trained into these models so that it sort of alleviates the need to ever buy the book itself or ever alleviate the need to sort of buy a stock photo image if I can just go to Midjourney and create one?
I mean, I don't know that human ingenuity and creativity can ever be replaced. And, what you're talking about are broader both policy issues as well as copyright issues and concerns. And this is where, in some cases, the law is very clear on how you protect and how you own these assets and how you make sure these assets don't leak. And in some cases, the law is evolving. And I think this is where, for all of the legal experts in the room, that they'll know this well, but this is where we all have to collectively really think through what that means. And you have to start to look at what is your data and assets, where are you putting it? You have to look at those organizations where you're putting it and what those terms are and what those terms mean in terms of how they can be leveraged. You're starting to see that happening in code generation. With software development, that's a big one. You talked about a lot of authors in the room, but those in the software development world know this well. How do you solve for attribution? And how do you make sure code attribution doesn't become an issue? So there are enough people on the legal teams that have been looking at this and what the implications are. But I think these are things that you have to start to think about as you start to consume this technology.
Okay. So let's talk about bias. Yesterday, the Biden administration issued an executive order trying to address bias in these AI models. And as you think about this issue of bias, you have not just gender bias and racial bias, but political bias. We're going into an election year, and how do you sort of generate models that are not biased, or religious bias, given what's happening with Israel and in the Gaza Strip right now? So talk to us about bias and what can be done, if anything, to avoid bias in the model building.
The poster child of bias. No, I mean, but that aside, this is where I think it's a community effort. How you build these models responsibly, and how you look for and you're intentional about inclusively building and evolving these and watching for those bias actions and signals, and making that available to people in terms of what you're driving is super important. It's not something just one organization can be the flag bearer of, but it's going to be a combination of organizations. It's going to be government. It's going to be academia. It's going to be thought leaders. It's going to take all of us as a community to come forward and really be intentional about this. And in terms of the executive order, what that is really signaling is that same intent of, and I've been in the government before, so I can tell you safely, that the government's job is to give you that oversight and that structure and that guidance. And the best outcomes happen when you see enterprises and government and thought leaders coming together to solve for these in a very thoughtful way. And I think I can speak for everyone in this room, regardless of who we work for or where we are. Everybody wants to use this responsibly. Everybody wants to make sure the intent is there. The big challenge we collectively have is how do we translate the intent into the right execution mechanisms so that we get the outcomes collectively for society.
Well, sure. Stephen Wolfram, I think, just made the comment that to a large degree, these are black boxes, right? They get trained on billions of parameters. We don't always know how they get trained. So let's talk about, for instance, the ethical AI, right? So what keeps me from saying, I want to create a nuclear bomb. Can you please explain to me how do I do that? Or I want to create a bioweapon. What's the best and cheapest way to do that? Like, how do we protect against those kind of scenarios?
I mean, I think there's a lot that's already underway with the community I mentioned, and even with what we're doing with a lot of the major corporations, us included, were voluntarily part of this whole process of saying, let's make sure that we are planning ethically, we're designing for and making sure we have testing both internal and external to make sure we avoid for such things. But having said that, I have not yet seen ever bad actors not trying to do something bad. But equally, I think we all also owe it to ourselves and to society to really use this technology for good in a much more meaningful way. And so we all tend to get worried about what people could do wrong. And I think equally we should be focusing on what good we can drive here. Because I do think there's a lot of upside on the good. And I'm not downplaying, but I'm saying that whole aspect of how we go drive for that, not just the ethics of it, but it's more importantly the right usage and putting in the right guardrails to make sure we're watching for these is going to be super important.
So how do we protect against this hallucination problem, right? So this idea where AI models are not very good at admitting that they don't know something, right? When I ask about, tell me some interesting things about you, it doesn't know, so maybe it makes some things up, or it stretches the truth. So again, can we trust these models? Are there things we can do to sort of build them in a way that if it doesn't know, it says it, as opposed to trying to make it up or extrapolate?
Yep, that's my 11-year-old kid at home. He makes up things too. It's actually a very human thing, right? I mean, sometimes when we say something we know, and sometimes we confidently talk about things we don't know. We've now formally called it hallucination. But I think this is genuinely an area where I think everybody is working very hard to solve for. You'll start to see, we do AI service cards, so we put use cases where you can use them, and we start to say, hey, here's some things you want to think about. So this is a problem everybody is working on actively. I think this is where how you fine-tune, the model you pick, the type of problem you're trying to solve, if it's a broad use case versus a narrow use case, all of those decision parameters help you get to a better accuracy level that you're trying to go for. Mm-hmm. But then...
Well, okay, so let's talk about models, right? So People are obviously familiar with ChatGPT. They'll soon be familiar with Anthropic, of course. There's a bunch of different models, though. I mean, there's probably hundreds of models out there. So how does a user or an enterprise or a government decide which model to use? And are all models the same, or talk to us about pros and cons of different models.
I think the big thing people need to focus on is what are the problems you're trying to solve? Because I think the nice part about the interest is everybody's trying to learn this technology and learn about the models and try to figure out what's happening. And there is tremendous amount of work happening. There are so many people building models, trying to innovate, trying to grow on it. But the biggest thing that you want people to think about is what is the problem you're trying to solve? And how is that problem going to be solved in the best way, maybe in the most cost-effective way, in the safest way, with the highest accuracy for what you want? And those use case types should really drive your model selection and choice. And you should know that models will evolve. There's way too many smart people, likely all in this room, that are also looking at this actively. And so the key is to have choice. You want to have choice. You actually don't want to have one model that effectively is the only go-to for everything, because you're not going to have the outcomes that you want. I believe, is that you want to have a perspective where models effectively should become commoditized, and they will be commoditized. And then your differentiation is your IP, your assets, the questions and the use cases you're framing to creatively go solve the problem. So I think we all need to collectively shift that perspective. And then we're all going to be thinking about how can this technology help us versus what can this technology do?
Okay, so two different visions of the future. One vision, which we heard a little bit about earlier today, the models go from millions of parameters to billions of parameters to trillions of parameters, and there's only a couple companies in the world that can afford to build these kind of models given all the compute cycles and all the cost. But there's been a lot of research lately about smaller, finely tuned models. So if I'm doing genetic research, maybe there's a specific model tuned for genetic research. It's not part of sort of ChatGPT. In my world, transportation, maybe there's one that understands all the roadway designs of the world, and it's tuned specifically to understand that. So which version of the future are we headed towards? One model fit, kind of uber alles because no one can afford to build these things anymore, or a bunch of fragmented different models tuned towards specific things?
I believe in choice, and I think it's early days. You cannot declare, and you should not declare a winner yet. This is not a mature technology. You heard all of the esteemed guests earlier talk about this. These are genuine, deep problems and deep areas that they've been looking at for decades. And you're starting to see just the tremendous value early on come out, and you're going to see, this is where I said I have a lot of faith in human ingenuity and creativity. You're going to see a lot more come out of this space. And so if I'm a betting person, I would bet on choice, I would bet on flexibility, I would bet on innovation, and a lot of transformation coming down the road.
Okay, so let's think about 5, 10 years from now. What do you get most excited about? What does AI allow us to do in 5, 10 years that we're not able to do today?
You don't even have to go 5, 10 years out. Even today, effectively, to me, it helps. We should all become better versions of ourselves and be working in a world where we're using this to really enhance and augment and speed up what we're doing. You just think about data that I had to probably go through 8 different loopholes to get access to, or an insight or a report that I had to get from 3 smart people to write up. I get a reasonably good compilation and analysis in the matter of seconds. That is incredibly powerful for the impact I have to drive. And so I think we have so much opportunity to take this and drive data into meaningful insights for the business in a fast way that we're only scratching the surface. And this is where I think we're going to see a very different world in 5 years, because we're just starting now. A lot of people, when they think use cases, some people try to boil the ocean and they say, I'm going to figure out all my use cases now, or I'm going to have a handful of use cases I care about. And I always tell people, get started. Because the moment you try to solve one problem, you start to see the value that you're getting out of it, and how you solve it, what you go after changes. Historically, you and I talked about this earlier. If you look at the companies that are the size they are today, and 15 years ago, the companies at the size they were completely different because they were solving for a different problem set. And that's what you're going to see in this space.
So I grew up in Detroit. Robotics completely transformed the way that you make cars, right? The human element, the number of labor, the cost of labor fundamentally changed as a result of robotics. So if I think about my company, I have several hundred engineers working for me writing code, but now code can largely be written through AI. So do I have half as many employees in the future? Or what does this do to white-collar labor and knowledge workers?
I would think instead of worrying about having half as many, you should be looking at tripling your business. I mean, this is where you have to have ambition. Like, if I have 20 smart people and I can give them the tools where they can do 30% more work, I should be thinking about how do I use that in a way to materially grow faster. I think the winners in this space are not going to be the fact, everybody's talking about it, right? All of us are. Let's candidly, I mean, I don't think any of us have not been in this discussion, but what gets us ahead is who executes and who has that ambition. So I should say you should triple or quadruple your business.
Fair point, fair point. Okay, one last question. That is, if you think about sort of the future, obviously, this takes a lot of talent. We just don't have a lot of AI experts in the world, right? We were talking about a company before that's kind of looking for a chief AI officer. I don't even know where they come from. So how do we solve this gap between the need that the market has and the technology industry has for AI knowledge workers, and schools just don't even know what those things are yet in terms of people coming out of schools with training in that area?
I think that's where we've been really focusing on making sure we drive the tools and capabilities so that your existing workforce can consume it in a way that they can drive the impact. You're going to have some level of new roles, but you don't want suddenly to come up with 50 new descriptions of what people need to do, and then suddenly we're all again scrambling for the same set of talent in 8 different ways. The best way to scale this, if we truly want to collectively scale this in a massive way, we should be looking at our existing workforce and saying, how do we give them this capability in an extensible, consumable way that they can materially go make changes in their business? And you think about it, even a 10-20% productivity or a 10-20% efficiency in what we do has material benefits to our business collectively. That's what we need to all do. So it's how do you take your developers and give them the tools so they're producing more better quality work for you? How do you take your customer care agents and give them more capabilities so they can actually turn to better value and outcomes for you? That's more important than trying to say, hey, can I now come up with a new job description that fits in there? So while you want to prepare for those skills, and where we have a bunch of training, we're getting a lot of this awareness and skills out, equally, we're being very focused on the fact that we want to simplify how people use it, and we want people to absorb it into their day-to-day so that they can actually go drive better outcomes.
We have 15 minutes remaining, so if there are questions in the audience, I'd encourage you to come up to the microphone here, and in the meantime, you can continue your conversation.
Sure. So I can't even see the...
Are there questions? Please approach the microphone.
We've left them speechless.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, so while we're waiting for someone to come up, what scares you the most? What scenario, obviously there's been dozens of movies written about AI and kind of the horrors of AI. What scares you the most in terms of a realistic scenario?
Nothing scares me. But I say this with good intent. I mean, I worked in many places outside of that description that you gave of me, but one of my roles, I was the CTO for Washington, D.C. And when you work in the government and you work for a city that's pretty prominent, you see risks firsthand, and you learn to deal with risks firsthand, and you learn to adapt, and you learn to manage these environments. So I have probably, through that and several experiences, nothing scares me. What worries me is that we will sometimes probably limit what we can do in anticipation of what could go wrong, versus being intentional about the risks we have, intentional about the opportunities we have, and doing our thoughtful best that we can collectively do to make it a better place. That's what we should do.
Hey, Brian, it's Matt. Matt McElwain with Madrona Venture Group. Great comments, John. Thank you so much. You started to hint at a little bit all this choice and all these different models. And I think you've got a service called Bedrock that's meant to be one where you can kind of go pick and find these different models. I'm curious if I'm understanding the strategy of Bedrock correctly. And specifically, are we going to see OpenAI models on Bedrock at some point?
That's a question for OpenAI. I mean, but I think from a Bedrock perspective, our goal was, again, just to give the best of breed models available to you so you can consume it in a meaningful way. And we've been actively working on that. And we'll continue to do that. And our goal, even with Bedrock, is to continue to simplify the experience of how people consume it. So, if there's any feedback, if people have used it or want to use it, please let me know.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would just add to that, Matt. The company I'm at, we basically have a transportation-related effort that we've creating an AI, and we've been able to test it across 6 or 7 different models and sort of look at the results from 6 or 7 different models. Because again, these models, for the large part, are black boxes to you as the customer, as the enterprise. You don't really know how they work inside. So being able to sort of test a variety of different models has actually been very useful for us, as opposed to having one model and one model only.
Thank you. It's always good when the customer tells you.
George.
The various incumbent companies in AI have been most aggressive in asking for regulation and national guidance and really, in effect, establishing the existing model as the prevailing model. And how do you, why is it that do I have the motivations right, or does Microsoft really want some bunch of bureaucrats in the Department of Homeland Security to decide the parameters of your AI program? I mean, it's really bizarre what's going on from my point of view. And it seems to me there are just, AI is the next computer platform. It's all this mystification, even that Wolfram offered, is really spurious. It's just another tool. And to have the prevailing tool specially regulated in detail in Washington will kill it.
So let me translate that
I
into
know.
a question.
I think. Well, thank you, sir, for that question. But I would reserve that question for the next panel. I think, when the set. But I think, look, we have to be super balanced about how we engage with everyone. I know, at least on our end, we've been making sure. We've been working with the government. We've been working with anybody. We are educating them as much as we can on driving the choice perspective, on making sure that innovation is not stifled, and that not just here in the US, but around the world, as countries are thinking about this and are investing in it, that we really bring that ideas and those innovation forward in a meaningful way. And we'll continue to work with those guardrails and concerns. So we are a big supporter of driving innovation, and we will continue to do that. I don't know, and I'd probably be making like an uneducated comment on what the position of another organization is, candidly, which is why I'd let them handle why they are supportive or not supporting of it. But I think just from what we're seeing and what we're doing, we're trying to be very proactive and engaging and offering up insights and information and just partnering with not just government, but our customers that are working and that have to be responsible for this to make sure we get it in the right direction.
Well, so let me ask a related question. Can you even regulate these models? So the U.S. could create regulation and say, okay, the models can't spit out, recipes for bioweapons or pornography or whatever. But these are borderless. You could have a model in China that you could access through the internet, and people can basically get around it. So is regulation even applicable? I mean, is it useful?
I mean, all the governments are looking at it, right? So it's not just that you only have an executive order that was issued here. If you talk to any of the countries around the world, there are a number that already have some level of guidance in place, or they're getting some guidance or perspective in place. And you have to sort of recognize that, again, I believe in the good intent everybody has from this. Government's job is to watch and manage these. Our job is to continually drive and push for innovation, and we have to work together in a meaningful way for what comes out of it. So when you say, it's a broad statement, right? When you say, does regulation even matter? I mean, you and I could pontificate about that for the next hour, but the reality is you have these frameworks, and they're coming, everybody comes from it in their own vantage point with good intent, and we have to get to a point where it works and we don't stifle innovation in any way, shape, or form.
So I've worked with a lot of global corporations, like the Unilevers and the Procter & Gamble, the biggest in the world. And what worries me is that every word like good or better has a context. And over the last 5 years, I keep hearing this is so good and we're going to regulate it so good. And yet if I go downtown to Seattle, which I haven't been to in years, it's a mess. And I work with girls around the world, and what's happening to their mental health? It's going down. So what concerns me is if we're setting a concept of good by the same people that maybe have to stop and say, who gets to decide what is good? And I'm really concerned about regulating this unless we're willing to look at what's happening to our youth today and what's happening to our towns today and our safety. And so I think we just can't go around and use words like better and good because that's assuming we know what that is. And I think we need to reconsider that. And these words are nice, like inclusive, but the impact that I'm seeing is down, especially for the youth. So,
do you want to, either of you want to offer a final word on that or anything else? And then we'll go ahead.
Well, thank you for the question. And I think this is where, as a society, we always have to have those dialogues and those discussions. Again, I don't think anybody that says good is coming from a bad place. In their own definition or their own vantage point, we're all shaped by our experiences. And when we're trying to do good or we're trying to have a perspective, we're doing it from what we know best, right? And sometimes those come inherently with maybe perspectives and influences, but the general intent is there. And I think a huge part of when you see technology as this, I think insights from people such as yourselves that have had the experience looking at this is super valuable because it helps shape and it helps us question. It helps keep us all honest as best we can. And it helps sometimes expose things we hadn't thought about. So keep doing what you're doing. So thank you for that. And just know that I think all of us, most of us, are really trying to pay attention to it as best we can. And we'll continually take that feedback. So thank you.
That's great. Can we give them a hand?
Thank you.
I will add, Archana, that we are also an AWS client, but significantly smaller than INRIX. So thank you for that.